So yeah, what do I want to talk about today? Leslie here came up with the theme. We were just talking. We're in a season where we highlight one of our values, which tend to rotate. If you're new here, I'll read our value: care for the earth. We care for our earth home with mindfulness and responsibility for ourselves and for future generations. Seems like a value worth um, poking around in. And so the question over the next I'm going to do 3 weeks in a row. So if you don't like me, just wait. Come back in 3 weeks. Um, and the question will revolve around the question of what is wild? What is wild? And I want to explore that from like several different ways. And I want to start, I think, this morning with this little line from Gary Snyder, the poet, which was in your little handout. To speak of wilderness is to speak of wholeness. To speak of wilderness is to speak of wholeness. Not perfection so much, not like some sort of paradise era like Garden of Eden, but wholeness. To speak of wilderness is to speak of wholeness, and human beings came out of that wholeness. So, whatever we mean by nature, the real, we emerged up out of. We are as much wilderness as Wilderness State Park in northern lower Michigan, or what is it called? Rosie Mound something area? Let's just call it Rosie Mound for short. You, you, you and I emerged up out of that kind of wholeness. To speak of wilderness is to speak of wholeness. Now, technically, I think if we could maybe look at this line from a poem in a more philosophical sense for just a moment, I think he's pointing out that the wilderness itself, the wild, or even the wild-ish kinds of places, is a self-regulating whole. If you stand in a meadow, there's no problem, really. What's the problem with a wild meadow? It doesn't even occur to you as a question. It's a self-regulating whole. That doesn't mean it functions statically. In fact, it's a wild it's a wild exchange between chaos and order, or what the Greeks would call eros and logos. Eros, where we get words like the erotic, the fire of life, and logos, where we get the origins of reason and logic. It's these two things that are part of this self-regulating whole. And so in a meadow, you might have a season where you have an invasive species. And it might do well for a while until it doesn't do well for a while. You might have one part of the animal kingdom thriving while another part is suffering. But it's a kind of self-regulating whole out of which we emerged. You and I, human beings. And even our own psyches emerged in this kind of wild exchange, self-regulating system. And the thing about self-regulating systems, when they get out of whack, something happens. Like if your body, which is a self-regulating system, you didn't wake up and say, okay, time to remember heartbeat, okay, check. Breathing, check. No, it's a self-regulating whole in and of itself. You are a little universe. You are a meadow. Walking around, you're a meadow. And when things get out of balance, your body wakes up and says, hey, I'm out of balance. And you get illnesses, sometimes diseases. Now, that's not always true. Sometimes some outside force can come in and cause a kind of reaction or trauma to the body itself. But you are a meadow walking around. And if you are experiencing health issues, in some sense, it's your body saying, I'm out of balance. Same with a meadow. When a self-regulating whole is out of balance with a particular invasive species, the whole thing suffers, correct? And it's either going to be addressed by the unfolding patterns of nature, or sometimes there can be some human intervention. Like if those Asian carp make it into the Great Lakes, You say, oh my God, that could never happen. Well, you know what? You know what else is in the Great Lakes? Salmon. You know who put them there? We did. It's an invasive species. They're not natural. So then we're like, how can something screw up the Great Lakes? Oh, we did like 50 years ago. And I'm not anti-salmon, all right? I've caught a few myself. I'm just saying the self-regulating whole that is the Great Lakes, when you throw something in there and say, oh, this will be fun, see what happens, it will get out of whack. So, to speak of wilderness is to speak of wholeness. And I'm going to do it over, like I said, 3 weeks. And I'll try to go slow and not get ahead of myself. But just a quick comment about Darwin. Darwin, who, it's funny because if you come from like a religious background, very religious, like I grew up in a pretty religious background, saying a word like Darwin was like Satan, you know. I didn't realize that. I mean, I don't know what he would call himself, but he was a religious, spiritual person, you know. This, for him, the kind of work he was doing was just as relevant as going to seminary. I mean, what else? What could be more important than paying attention to what's real? You know, what's actually the case with the world or creation? So anyway, Darwin, most commonly we associate him with the survival of the fittest, correct? Which we take to mean very dog-eat-dog kind of world. Nasty, nature red in tooth and claw, violent kind of get what you can to survive. Actually, that's not actually what Darwin meant by survival of the fittest. He meant survival of those most able to fit in. That's what he meant. It was a cooperative metaphor. And he said the species that are most able to cooperate will survive. So talk about misunderstanding Darwin on a most basic level. And the interesting thing about what he was saying as he came into contact with the wild world and its wholeness is that we live right now in a world where everything is out of whack just by sheer population. Just by sheer population of human beings on the planet, we're disrupting this kind of wholeness. We know that to be the case. And the question becomes, will we largely operate with a mindset of survival of the fittest, or do we have the capacity to actually do what's in our very genes, which is the survival of those most able to fit in, which is a cooperative kind of place. That lives within. We think it doesn't. We think if we trust evolution, we're going to screw everything up. What I'm saying is we got here by no faith in evolution. It just happens because it's a kind of wholeness. That doesn't mean it's all pretty, by the way. It's complicated. It's chaos and order. It's eros and logos. And that is actually happening within our own psyches. This kind of tension I'm describing, but that's next week. All right. Now, I was down in Marco Island. You familiar with this place? Evolution designed Marco Island to house hundreds of thousands of vacationers. Of course. Why else would it be there, you know? I mean, what's the point of a wild space if we can't just mow it down? So I was in Marco Island. The funny thing about Marco Island is that, number one, it's filled with a lot of Christians from West Michigan, I've noticed. And the other thing is that at sunset, there's a migratory pattern that happens. And first of all, the crabs come out and they wave. Okay? These male crabs with one large arm, and they wave. And, you know, the myth is, I don't know, they're calling in the ocean. They're actually like, it's a mating thing, like my claw is bigger than your claw, but... and then the human beings come out about the same time that the waving crabs come out, and they like move toward the edge of the ocean like this, and they stand there and they watch the sun go down. Why? They can't even help it. I don't know why. And at this particular place in Marco Island, if you've been there, this is even funnier. A trumpet begins to play in the background, coming from the balconies, Amazing Grace, which always makes me laugh. Like, for some reason, I think it's funny. But what are we doing? What are we doing? I would say, on the unconscious level, we're drawn to the wholeness of wild places. There's nothing more wild than the edge of the ocean or the edge of Lake Michigan. You don't believe me? Go swim out as far as you can without stopping, and partway you'll think, I'm in a wild place and I'm going to die. It's the edge of the wilderness. And it's also, what I would say, it's luring us into its own wholeness. We emerged up out of the ocean. We know that to be the case. And something in our deep unconscious knows that to be the case. And that's what's drawing us in part to the edge of the ocean, just to stand there and watch the sun go down. And what else is happening? It's reminding us that there's some larger pattern than our own life. And the sun of our own life is going to go down and we're going to die. That's why people are gathering at Marco Island on the edge of the beach. They just don't, they're not quite conscious of it, but that's what they're there doing. There's a kind of wholeness, there's a kind of whole pattern that's luring us. And then we throw in a little amazing grace to make us feel a little better that we're going to die. But that's really what's happening. And I would also say it's actually good for people. It's good for people. I don't mean just vacationing is good for people, but I mean to stand on the edge of the ocean is good for your soul, because it's a reminder of what's true on the deeper level. To speak of wilderness is to speak of wholeness, and human beings came out of that wholeness. And the more contact we have with this kind of wholeness, the better the world is. We know that to be the case. If you and I aren't very whole, we're just going to transmit most of our brokenness. Now, you're going to do it anyway. That's called raising kids. Just transfer your brokenness onto them. But the capacity to grow in wholeness, in my view, part of the ingredients of moving in that direction is contact again with wild places, with nature. It doesn't have to be Yellowstone. It can be under a maple tree in your local park. It can be. Just to sit there in the cycles and seasons of what we call nature is to reconnect us with something true. And we live in a world, we know that, a very mechanistic world that is super disconnected from wilderness, from the wild within, and also from the natural seasons and patterns of life. And you know that to be the case because you're used to going year-round 72 degrees. It's possible to live year-round at 72 degrees. That is not natural. Nothing about that is natural. And then we wonder why we're so existentially lost, you know? It's like something gets out of whack with these natural rhythms. So talking about the wild or asking what is wild is not like for nature people, like those who shop at whatever, LL Bean, and I don't even know if people shop at LL Bean. It just popped into my head, you know. Like some people are kind of into hiking, and other people are like, well, I'm not into hiking. What I'm talking about is the very essence of what it means to be a human being. Nobody gets out of being a nature lover. If you hate nature, you hate yourself, is what it boils down to. So, one of the things we learned from the wild is that it cannot be possessed. It cannot be possessed. Nothing about the wild can be possessed. Can you possess a herd of elk? What's to be possessed? Can you possess the ocean? Can those in Marco Island who pay those taxes and live in those condos, do they possess the ocean? One hurricane will remind you, you do not possess this place. Now, I'm not much of a political scientist, meaning I'm not a political scientist. And don't know that much about the origins of personal possession. In other words, property. But I will tell you this, from a psycho-spiritual point of view, it's an illusion. That's what Eckhart Tolle is talking about here. It's an illusion. Personal property is an illusion. How do we know that? Because you're going to die. That's how we know that. And you can't take it with you. Now somebody brought up the estate tax. That's another conversation. You're going to die. Even the clothes that you die in are going to rot off your body. Boy, welcome to C3. A lot about death this morning. By the way, none of that is in my little scratchy notes. I wasn't like, today I'm going to get up and talk about death. It's just now occurring to me. The wild cannot be possessed. But we live in a culture that's under the illusion of possession. Things. And we think things, by possessing them, will give us a sense of identity. And actually, deeper than that, we think it will give us back our wholeness that's missing. And we know that intellectually. Shop here, buy this kind of house, go to this kind of schools, whatever system, live in this zip code, possess things. We know things. And if I get those things, the funny thing about it is that it works for 10 seconds. That's what keeps the thing going. You actually, when you pull in the driveway and you put that baby in park, and you're like, I did it. It feels awesome. Until 3 weeks later, and your neighbor gets another car, and you're like, well, maybe I should have got that one, and then the whole thing starts over again. That's called our economy, built on a giant illusion that possessions and things will give you a sense of identity. Contact with wild is the thing that puts us in better relationship with this dynamic because it cannot be possessed. It's humiliating to stand on the edge of the ocean. It is. It's humbling. You think, who am I? Who am I? Marching around as if I own the place. There are more crabs with giant arms on this beach, than probably the amount of money I will ever make. So this is what wild can teach us. And if you think there's a kind of sickness in our culture around possession and power. I was talking to a friend of mine this week, and this is a little bit dark, but we were talking about all the incredible mainstream news coverage and exposure around sexual harassment and sexual abuse coming out in the open. And not just, political party has nothing to do with it. Conservative, liberal, nothing to do with it. The so-called liberal, progressive Hollywood establishment is just as guilty as the right-wing, conservative, whatever. You know what I'm saying? It's not a matter of political affiliation or philosophy. Some darkness has been buried for a while, and when it first comes out of the darkness, it's quite scary, and we're having to look at it again. And so anyway, I was talking to a friend of mine about this, and he was reminding me, he's like, do you remember when Trump signed an executive order opening up new areas for drilling? First of all, he was sitting there, white man surrounded by other white men, signing a piece of paper that we can, and yes, I mean this, there's an innuendo coming, we're going to allow more shafts to be drilled down into the earth to take whatever we want. Yeah. Okay? See, it's present. It's there. It's there in our system, and we honor it. We say that's what power is. Taking what we want, when we want, from whom we want, because it's an up-down relationship. Because we can. See, contact with the wild again is humiliating. It's humiliating. It's a humiliating prospect to take up oil from the earth and say, it's ours. And everyone's saying, if you do this. Did you notice in the news this week, 210,000 gallons of crude oil spilled in South Dakota at the very pipeline where people were saying, if you take it from the earth, it's going to spill on the earth. And they're like, we got this, guys. 3 months later, it's covering every living thing. So it's a scary time to be alive, really, because our capacity, it used to be that we could cut down forests, but now our capacity to cut down mountaintops is making the world much sicker. And part of the question is, how do we return to such wholeness? And I understand there are political positions that you can take, but psycho-spiritually, the lack of balance and connectedness to our own wholeness is the starting place. Nobody gets out of their own personal work, is what I'm saying. You can make all the policies you want, but nobody gets out of their own personal work. So what is your personal relationship with things? That's kind of what I'm asking today. What's your personal relationship with it? Do you possess them? Eckhart Tolle says, this is in his book, A New Earth. He says, if you want to begin kind of a new spirituality, just start by checking out your relationship with the word mine, like mine or my. Start going down the list. My job, my spouse, my kids. Okay, I have kids. They're my kids, except sometimes they do things that are like, that's not my kid. I'm not taking responsibility for that creature. And all of a sudden you realize it is kind of an illusion. What do you possess? Your 401k? I'm telling you, one day on the stock market, buy one bad day. And it's all to the wind. So I think I see this as a kind of invitation, this kind of spirituality. My country. My country, 'tis of thee. My country? I own this country? I possess this country? I don't think so. I understand we play a game. There is a such thing called the United States of America. And we have sort of agreed for the time being, this is where we live and this is how we're going to do business. And it's good, it's politics. We argue about how we're going to do business, how we're going to live together in this thing called my country. But do any of us own anything here really on the deeper level? Sometimes I think about that. I'm just going to go straight for more death. The largest volcano in the United States, actually in North America, is basically the state of Wyoming. It's where Yellowstone is. If it goes off, we're done. It's not like, no, I've got my bottled water in the basement. No, it's over. You're just buried down there in your bottle with your bottled water for about 2 days and then it's over. No offense. What can you do about that? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Yeah, but I own land in Wyoming. You do not. You're just borrowing it in your mind for a while. And the question becomes, in terms of new vision for the future, how can we begin to cooperate with the places we find ourselves in? Not possess them, not cling to them, but cooperate with them. All right, let me see. I haven't looked at my notes for a long time, so who knows what I'm supposed to be saying. So one suggestion I might offer today. Well, two, but the first was I just mentioned a few minutes ago. What is your relationship with the word mine? Or my? What do you think is really going on there? And the second is more of a question. What can we do to break this pattern of possessiveness? What can we do to break? And I would like to suggest modestly that contact with wildness helps break the illusion of possessiveness. If we were to right now all migrate over to the edge of Lake Michigan and stand there on the edge of the shoreline and say, this is not mine. What would that feel like? This is not mine. Then what is it? We begin to realize that we are participants in a system that's much larger than us. Correct? We begin to touch upon the sheer, speaking, Rod, of your meditation, gratitude for simply being another being on this earth for a limited time. Having really limited ability to manipulate, control, use, or, other words, love the life that we've been given. There is a relationship. Now, you can think those thoughts, but I'm telling you, the wild world itself pulls it out of you. It pulls out what's already true on the deeper level. So I want to end with a poem. This is a poem, big surprise. Always throwing in poems. This is a poem by Mary Oliver. It's funny because I thought, I'm going to use a Mary Oliver poem today. I thought of it this morning, and I went down, I pulled this book down from the shelf, and I opened it, and I found in here a sermon, and I never write out my sermons, so this is a sermon. And it was a sermon I wrote exactly 2 years ago today, and it's the sermon of when I just quit my job. It's my public quitting sermon, which I haven't really thought about since then. I just thought, wow, interesting. 2 years to the day. I pulled down, I'm going to use a different Mary Oliver poem, in case you think I'm about to quit. I thought, man, the world is weird. And what was and I was just remembering that day and this feeling of I'm going towards something, but I don't know what that is. I'm leaving one way of being in the world and I'm walking toward this other way of being in the world. And that's the kind of life I want to live. And that's the kind of thing I'm talking about. Leaving one way of being in the world, survival of the fittest, power, possessions, identity around things, and beginning to venture toward the unknown, toward the wild. What might that be like? So anyway, this is a Mary Oliver poem called Wild Geese. It's a poem about place, our place in the world. It's a poem about wholeness, really. It's a poem about identity. It's about a poem. It's in part a poem about the essence of our own souls and the soul of the world in kind of conversation. So in other words, who we are in the deeper level and the conversation about whatever the animus mundi is, the soul of the world. It's a poem, I think, that has the capacity to shift our consciousness and invite us into the very thing I'm trying to describe today. So here it is. It's called Wild Geese. You do not have to be good. You do not have to be good. If you're a Christian Reformed, you're thinking, yes, you do. You do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert repenting. You do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert repenting. You just have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. You just have to let the soft, wild animal, wild, of your body love what it loves. Tell me about your despair, yours, and I will tell you about mine. Meanwhile, the world goes on. Meanwhile, the world goes on. Tell me about your despair, yours, and I will tell you about mine. Meanwhile, the world goes on. Meanwhile, the sun and the clear pebbles of rain are moving across the landscapes. Over the prairies and the deep trees, the mountains and the rivers. Meanwhile, the world goes on. Meanwhile, the wild geese. Did you see any this morning? I did. Meanwhile, the wild geese, high in the clean blue air, are heading home again. Whoever you are, no matter how lonely, the world offers itself to your imagination. Whoever you are, no matter how lonely, the world offers itself to your imagination. Calls to you. The world calls to you like the wild geese, harsh and exciting, over and over again, announcing your place in the family of things. Thanks for listening.